Welcome to this video for March 27th, 2022, and it'll be the fourth Sunday in Lent that we're coming up to. Normally what I have been doing is maybe having a little bit of a message and then showing you the previous week's Zoom service so that you can see the fellowship and hear the prayer concerns that people had and kind of stay in touch with the people that were a part of the Zoom service from week to week, and also showing you what we did from most of the live service. Last Sunday, I forgot to press record, so I don't have a video from last week from any of that. So I did want to, though, take some time to look at the series that we've been doing since December, the series on the Gospel of John, and to talk a little bit about what we've seen so far with John's Gospel. So the first thing I want to point out is that I've made a number of changes to the lectionary. I like this narrative approach very much, but I also sometimes see some issues that I want to tinker with and to change things around a little bit. January 9th, the lectionary called for us to look at the wedding at Cana, but we have a tradition that we do part 2 of our Christmas pageant in January, so that required us to look at Matthew 2. The way we've done our Christmas pageant for the last number of years is that we look at Luke's story of Jesus' birth in December, a week or two before Christmas. We have the children's Sunday school pageant. And then about the second week of January, we look at Matthew's version of Jesus' birth, which talks about the Magi, which aligns with Little Christmas, or El Dia de los Tres Santos Reyes. A tradition in many Latin American countries and also in Eastern Orthodox, Eastern European countries, is to have January 6th be the date that they celebrate Jesus' birth, when the gifts are brought by the Magi. The next time I made a change, there's a long portion where Jesus talks about, I am the bread of life. I shortened that because it was leaving out the miracle that Jesus had that accompanied that. And so I decided that it's one of the few ways in which John's gospel aligns with the other gospels, and it's an important story, it's an important sign. There's not a lot of miracles in John's gospel, not as many as the others, and I think Jesus talking about the bread of life should not really be separated from him performing that miracle. It's right there alongside of it, and it is meant to be the way in which we understand the miracle of Jesus talking about the bread of life. So I decided to make the bread of life discourse shorter, and to then include the miracle, the sign of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, or the loaves and fish. We say fishes because the King James says fishes. The next week was supposed to be about the living water. So you notice here in John's Gospel, bread of life, I will give you living waters, that Jesus uses a lot of metaphors in John's Gospel. But what I noticed is that we were missing we were just going to be skipping a chapter there that talked about the woman who was accused of adultery. And I thought that with so few women having stories in the Gospels and the Bible generally, and that being a story that people really adore, Christians and non-Christians know this story as something that tells us something about Jesus' heart. I thought it was important to include that story. So instead of Jesus' discourse on living water, I included the story about the woman accused of adultery, who the men wanted to stone, and that Jesus said, if you haven't sinned, you can throw the first stone. What I liked about this narrative lectionary is the way in which it does not give us long speeches, and John is big on long speeches. The narrative lectionary focuses on the action that happens, the narrative elements, the narrative plot, the story, the people. So when the narrative lectionary is leaving out parts of the narrative and instead going to these long speeches that Jesus does, I've decided to default back to the story that's being skipped, and not focusing so much on the long speeches. The next change I made was that the lectionary was going to leave out the story of Mary anointing Jesus' feet. And I decided that's another woman who gets a very prominent story in the gospel, and there wasn't a good reason to leave that out. There was every reason to put it back, especially when you can then go to the following chapter, the following week, and look at how Jesus washed the disciples' feet. So those two stories of Mary anointing Jesus' feet and Jesus washing the disciples' feet are right next to each other in John's Gospel. That's another one of the strengths of the narrative gospel, is that you see things in sequence. The usual lectionary that we usually use, the Revised Common Lectionary, that many Protestants and Catholics will use something like the narrative, like the Revised Common Lectionary, skips around so much that you don't see the sequence that you're going through. And it skips from one gospel to another so that you're not consistently sticking with one gospel and seeing that that gospel has its own themes and its own language and its own terms that it uses. So following those first 2 weeks of Lent, what the narrative lectionary has us do is go right into Holy Week. So it's very unusual even for the narrative lectionary to look at the stories from Holy Week 3 weeks before we get to Holy Week. But I think it's a great idea to do that. But what I noticed here again was I had to put Mary's anointing back in there, even though that's just before Holy Week. I think that was a good way to lead up to Holy Week. Also, what we have here is we have a lot on Peter's denial. We have 2 weeks of Jesus's trial, Jesus before Pilate. And so in order to make the room for the story about Mary, I thought we could probably condense these into 1 week. Also, the trial of Jesus is meant to emphasize Jesus' innocence, the miscarriage of justice that's happening. But one of the consequences of that is that a lot of people decide that they know who's to blame and that they want to blame the Jews. And of course, we've seen a long history of anti-Semitism that's become quite violent and even mind-bogglingly genocidal in its rage. So I think that we have to be very careful about how we use that trial story of Jesus in order to really focus on what's supposed to be the main point and maybe downplay some of the more disturbing aspects that people have kind of twisted it into. So I have, for the past couple of years, talked to people about this problem of anti-Semitism that comes up on Palm Sunday, that comes up when the Passion story is read, which comes up on Good Friday. Historically, particularly in the Middle Ages, but not just in the Middle Ages, Christians would go on rampages, destroying Jewish villages and attacking Jews. So some real atrocities have been carried out that were, the story of Jesus' passion, the story of Jesus' trial, were used deliberately to incite violence against Jews. So I think it's very important to realize that we need to acknowledge that and try to do better. So I've inserted this into the bulletin around Lent, especially around Palm Sunday. For centuries, there have been Christians who have said the Jews killed Jesus. There are a number of reasons why this is false. It is also proven to be a dangerous distraction from the deadly departure from our central message. It's an ugly and hateful ideology. It's also illogical. First reason is it's wrong to say that Jesus was killed wrongly, or that Jesus was killed with people who we should be angry at, or we should want to punish, or we should want to blame, because that's why Jesus came. Jesus came in order to die. It was his mission to die on a cross and to rise again, to show divine sacrificial love and to show God's ability to conquer death. It's wrong to make it sound as if some nefarious group prevented Jesus from what he came to do. No one diverted or defeated Jesus. He defeated sin and death. Secondly, Jesus was sentenced to die by a Roman governor of a brutal imperial occupying force. So very often people read this trial and as if Pilate, can't do what he wants to do. Pilate is being, bullied by the crowd into sentencing Jesus. So the idea that a Roman governor could have been swayed by a mob, when even today I don't know that there are many instances in which crowds or mobs are able to influence government action. It's really kind of absurd to think that a Roman governor, given the way in which they ruled, would not be able to have the sentence that he wanted. Third, it's to say that Jews killed Jesus strongly implies that Jesus was not Jewish himself. when he and all of his followers were completely Jewish. And Jesus never broke with that faith. Sometimes when I've said to people, Jesus was a Jew, they say, yeah, he was, and then he changed, but that's not true. When people say that the Jews are responsible for killing Jesus, they do this partly in ignorance, but often in order to gain political power. There are people who use this lie. There are people who use this misrepresentation of the gospel for their own means of getting power. And I think that's true today, even as it was in the past. Christians have been guilty of anti-Semitic teachings and actions. In 1994, the ELCA issued a declaration of the ELCA to the Jewish community. And you can look that up on our website. So that brings us to this week, the fourth Sunday in Lent. And what we mentioned is that we've skipped a couple of weeks. Maybe just let me look at the bottom here. What we've done is you can see chapter 11, chapter 11 and 12, chapter 13 and 14, chapter 13 and 18, and then we go back to chapter 12 because that's the Palm Sunday reading. So we're skipping Palm Sunday to come to the third, fourth, and fifth weeks of Lent, but then we're going to go back to chapter 12 when we get to Palm Sunday. So last week we skipped that chapter of his arrival in order to be in Jerusalem on Holy Week for the third through fifth Sundays. And then following the fifth Sunday, we will go back to Jesus' arrival on Palm Sunday. This week, we're going to go from beginning in chapter 13 to then skipping to the middle of 18. We're going to skip 5 chapters, and these are between Jesus' washing of the feet of the disciples to getting to chapter 18, where Jesus has been arrested, and Peter denies that he even knows him for fear that he will be arrested too. So what we're skipping is Jesus' farewell discourse. So that stretches from chapter 14, chapter 15, chapter 16, chapter 17. Again, John has these long speeches that Jesus gives that are really uncharacteristic. And none is longer and more uncharacteristic than what he does at this meal with the disciples. It's generally understood that this farewell discourse is part of the Last Supper. Some people will say, though, that it doesn't contain the bread and the wine being shared by Jesus. So some people would say it's not actually the Last Supper. But since John doesn't mention that, it seems that John is talking about the Last Supper in his own way, in which he focuses on Jesus washing the feet and on this farewell discourse. So there's a disparity there, and some people would dispute, is this the Last Supper or is this a different supper? And what it seems like, to me, is that John just tells these events from a different perspective in which we see different things about these events. So to me, it is the Last Supper, but that John is doing something different with the Last Supper. He's doing his own thing. So John is very often different from the other Gospels, but we'll see a lot of similarities when it comes to Jesus' trial. And maybe the similarity is because the Passion narratives are likely to be the first stories of Jesus that were part of an oral tradition, and so that there's more similarity there because they're earlier. But what we'll also know is that John has his particular way of looking at things. One, that Jesus is more in control in John's Gospel, even during his trial, even during his crucifixion. And as we get to this Last Supper, this supper that Jesus washes the disciples' feet, the beloved disciple makes an appearance, and that's entirely unique to John. Peter's denial is told in a way in which it is contrasted with Jesus' trial, so that we start with Peter being questioned by the woman saying, "Aren't you one of his followers?" To then seeing Jesus interrogated by religious leaders, local leaders, by Pilate, and that what you see in comparison is that Peter is reluctant to even answer questions, but that Jesus is very clever and he's taking charge of the conversation. He'll change the course of the conversation. Jesus is asked, and he says, "People have heard what I've had to say, and you can ask them." Peter doesn't want to answer anything, and he has the opportunity to say something, but he doesn't want to say anything. He's going to lie. He's going to deny that he knows Jesus. So the bottom line is that Jesus says nothing in secret. He's very open. He's very responsive, and Peter is hiding. So the way in which those two stories are told side by side, we have this fancy term here, intercalation, in terms of a narrative device that's used to have two stories being told. This is very common in any drama that you watch, any serial drama that you watch. You'll have 3 or 4 different stories, and they all seem to reflect on a similar theme. So Lent is about this suffering that Jesus went through, and it's not something that most people want to look at, to be watching suffering, to be witnessing suffering. But there's something about Lent that tells us that there is suffering in the world. We shouldn't want suffering for ourselves. We shouldn't be masochists. But there is suffering going on in the world, and Jesus' suffering in this story is telling us something about how we should attend to it and what it means and how God feels about it. Specifically that Jesus cares about this suffering. So I've decided not to do the 2 weeks of Jesus' trial, but instead focusing on the events around it, specifically what Peter does, what Judas does. So what I've done for this 4th week is to focus on 3 of Jesus' disciples, Peter, Judas, and the beloved disciple. I think sometimes Christians really focus on Judas and demonize Judas. It's part of this idea that we have to blame somebody for what happened to Jesus. It's Judas's fault. Judas is evil, and we can hate Judas and say how much we love Jesus at the same time. I think it's better to hold Peter and Judas side by side as examples of what all the disciples did, particularly the male disciples, which was to abandon Jesus. So Peter denies Jesus, Judas betrays Jesus. I think it's good to look at those side by side. And also, as we're looking at chapter 13 and chapter 18, and then the resurrection, we have these stories about the beloved disciple. So this is interesting. We have a disciple who's not named. We're just told it's the disciple whom Jesus loved. So it's kind of this deliberate ambiguity about who is this disciple. Why don't we get this disciple's name? So there's a lot of theories about why this is. If you read the books by Dan Brown, The Da Vinci Code, he follows the theory that it's a woman, that it's Mary Magdalene, and so that it's being disguised because it's a woman, because people want to conceal the relationship that Jesus had with Mary Magdalene. Because a woman won't be respected, it had to be concealed. So that's one theory. Another theory is that when Jesus gets the message that Lazarus is ill, it doesn't mention Lazarus' name. It says the one whom you love is ill. And then that's before, just before, the beloved disciple is sitting next to Jesus at the Last Supper. So some people would say, well, it says Lazarus is he whom he loves, without mentioning his name. And now here's a disciple whose name we're not getting, just getting that it's the one whom we love, or it's the one whom Jesus loved. So some people have that idea that it's Lazarus. I think a lot of people are not convinced of that because it's not clear that Lazarus was a disciple. It seems like Lazarus and Mary and Martha were friends of Jesus. You might consider them broadly to be followers of Jesus, but they're not considered to be among the 12 or among the closest disciples. So some people don't believe that it's Lazarus for that reason. Well, that's not a popular theory because of that. So this just kind of points out the fact that when we want to know who the 12 were, who those 12 apostles were, sometimes they're referred to as apostles, sometimes they're referred to as disciples, sometimes they're referred to the 12 as the 12. There's a lot of inconsistency. So here you get the 4 Gospels, and you can also look later at the Acts of the Apostles. But here are the 4 Gospels to get this idea of who were the 12. So they don't line up. One problem is that there are 3 Gospels that talk about a disciple named Bartholomew, and then John talks about Nathanael. John just has to mess everything up all the time, and he can't be consistent. Judas, there's a second Judas, not the Iscariot. Matthew seems to call him Thaddeus. Mark seems to call him Thaddeus. So there's some inconsistencies there. The one that's interesting to us as we're looking at this beloved disciple is where you get to John. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have a disciple named John. Peter, James, and John are often spoken of as a group. That's kind of the chief among the apostles, or the most visible among the apostles. And then John's gospel, which is not called John's gospel, we've given it that name. We've named these gospels because we want them to have names. The fourth gospel, the gospel we call the Gospel of John, does not mention a disciple named John. So some people have decided, well, John is talking about himself and he's not mentioning his name for whatever reason. Or the people who knew John and are writing about John want to give him that moniker to say the one whom Jesus loved, because they're followers of him. But that's one interesting thing, that there is no John among the disciples in John's gospel. But you can also see that there's no Matthew and there's no James. There's another Simon the Canaanite is not there in John's gospel, so John doesn't have a very full list of disciples. But this idea that he doesn't have a disciple named John, when that disciple, that apostle, was so prominent in the other gospels, has also led people to think that that's who wrote the gospel. And that's why it's called the Gospel of John, based on this theory that the unnamed disciple, the one that Jesus loves, is John. So let's read the gospel. So with that background, the good news according to John, the 13th and 18th chapter. Judas betrays, Peter denies. After washing the disciples' feet, John's gospel has Jesus deliver a discourse of 4 chapters. The disciple whom Jesus loves makes their first appearance at this meal. Jesus is arrested that night and crucified the following day. John writes, Jesus was very troubled in spirit and declared, "Very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of the disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "Do quickly what you are going to do." Now no one at the table knew why Jesus said this. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Judeans, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterwards." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. Then we skip, as I said, 4 chapters to chapter 18, and we're just finishing Jesus' discourse at this meal. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers, together with the police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "For whom are you looking?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "For whom are you looking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back in its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their officer, and the Judean police arrested Jesus and bound him. Peter follows the beloved disciple to a point, and as we're told, he denies Jesus. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again Peter denied it. At that moment the cock crowed. The Gospel of the Lord. So again, what you see, what I've chosen to do for this week is to hold Judas and Peter side by side. We see that Peter has denied Jesus, how there are so many times when he says, "I'll lay down my life for you, and I'll draw the sword for you, and I won't let anybody hurt you." He can be so bold at sometimes, but then when the chips are down, he really folds. See this side by side with Judas betraying Jesus, so that we're not singularly looking at Judas as if it's all his fault. Judas and all the disciples abandoned Jesus, were afraid for what was happening, were surprised at what was happening. There's a theory that Judas thought that Jesus was going to overtake the police, and then they could all lead a battle to take over Jerusalem. There's nothing really in the text to suggest that, but I think it's okay to wonder what Judas's motive might have been, and to think it could have been a complicated thing. Also, when we realize that his name being Judas is based on one of the 12 sons of Jacob, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Judah, that we refer to people today as Jews, taking from that idea that there was a Judea, that there was a Judah. This is part of the history that brings us today to referring to these people as the Jews. So it's very unfortunate that this historic demonizing of Judas corresponds to this idea of the Jews. So that there's such, Judas was a Jew is kind of the way that kind of combined in a very unfortunate way. The other thing we see in the reading that I just shared with you is the appearance of the beloved disciple. So there's something about the beloved disciple that he has kind of the first place. And he has more influence, and he gets more things done. So there's kind of a competition maybe between Peter, who is often thought of as the chief apostle, and the beloved disciple here. So when Peter wants to know what Jesus is talking about, he asks the beloved disciple to ask Jesus. So there's a way in which the beloved disciple is closer to Jesus, in proximity around the table, but that's in a way kind of symbolic of their relationship and of the very important position of the beloved disciple. Then when Peter and another apostle, it doesn't say the beloved disciple, but it seems to be the same disciple who's not being named, when they're trying to follow Jesus to see what's happening to him, it says the other disciple was able to get in, and then he vouched for Peter to get him in. Again, this idea that the beloved disciple it gets more done or is more successful than Peter. And then on Easter morning, we're going to see that the two of them are running a race. They have a foot race to see who can get to the tomb first. And Peter goes into the tomb first, but actually the beloved disciple beats him there. So again, there's this kind of rivalry that's going on between this unnamed beloved disciple who seems to be closer to Jesus and seems to have more connections to get into places, and seems to be faster when he's running than Peter. So that's just an interesting mystery. I'm not sure that it requires a lot of our effort to think about it, It's kind of intriguing. What's the reason for this disciple's name not to be given? But ultimately, the reasons that we can come up with are speculation, at least so far as what I've seen so far. That we can't really have a definitive idea. We can only have theories about who is this beloved disciple and what's the purpose of him not being named. One theory is that we just put ourselves in that place. He's an unnamed disciple who's important, who's with Jesus. Maybe the intention is that we kind of see ourselves there. And that's a possibility, I suppose. But it's a complete mystery. And it's kind of intriguing. And I think it's fun to have mysteries in our faith to remind us that we don't know everything. So that's our video for this week.